The United States is an incredibly diverse country. Whether by race or religion, ethnicity or language, Americans are a far from homogenous group and can trace their ancestry to every corner of the world. The country has also existed for hundreds of years, and taking up a vast swath of the North American continent, distinct cultural identities have developed within its borders. Even within these regions, though, sit areas where groups of people, whether through migration or geographic isolation, have developed a culture that's very different from the larger areas around them. These cultural enclaves are some of the most fascinating places in the United States, and are excellent examples of how geography helps shape cultural differences. I've made a series on out-of-place geographic features in the country, and some of you have suggested a similar video, just focused on human geography instead of the physical landscape. Hello and welcome to That Is Interesting. I'm your host Carter. Today, a few of the most fascinating cultural enclaves of the United States. Before we get started, I need to define what I mean by a cultural enclave. They need to stand out from their neighbors in terms of either religion, language or dialect, cultural practices, or some combination of the three. If an immigrant community has settled in a specific area but has fully assimilated in terms of cultural practices, religion, and language, they won't be included in this list. Additionally, they need to have a regional focus, to be culturally different from the areas around them and from large parts of the country as a whole. It's also important to keep in mind that shared ancestry is by no means a requirement for what I consider to be a cultural enclave. In fact, many of the groups in this list can trace their ancestry back to a number of different countries and ethnic groups. If they've lived as a somewhat isolated community for a long period of time, they often develop their own sense of shared identity and culture, which is really what makes them a cultural enclave. In addition, in one case in this list, I'm discussing 5 separate and distinct ethnic groups whose land sits side by side. I'm not saying that they're one specific cultural group, but their neighboring land as well as shared history is the reason I'm including them in the same section on this list. Also, I'm hoping to make this topic into a mini-series, so if you enjoyed it, leave a comment and let me know what cultural enclaves you'd like to see a video on. The first cultural enclave we'll be visiting is the hottest neighborhood in the country, Star Island, Miami, Florida. Famous residents include Shaquille O'Neal, Jennifer Lopez, Sean Puffy Combs. You can distinguish them by their mansions, sports cars, and their massive investment portfolios. Okay, obviously I'm joking around. I'll get to the actual list in a minute. But we can learn a thing or two from Star Island's newest resident, legendary hedge fund CEO Ken Griffin. Griffin owns 5 properties in the island worth a combined $200 million. But when he moved to Miami, he brought an asset worth 5 times that number with him. It wasn't a new tech company, it wasn't a fleet of vintage cars or private jets, it was his art collection. Yes, really, it's one of the oldest strategies in the game. Billionaires and CEOs are pouring hundreds of millions into assets like art that aren't necessarily correlated to the stock market, because when stocks crash or flatline like they've done recently, the value of these low correlation assets can continue to climb higher. Our sponsor for today is incredible because it gets you access to these same assets without you needing a Star Island-sized bank account. I'm talking about Masterworks.com, the art investing platform. What I like about them is that they've already delivered real results, paying out over $25.8 million in total last year to users like you. 11 exits now, with every single one returning a profit to their users. Masterworks has done so well, they've had to make a wait list, as paintings can sell out in minutes. But right now, my subscribers can't skip it. Just click the link in the description. For the first cultural enclave on this list, we head to the Sea Islands in the southeastern US. From beyond Wilmington, North Carolina to just past Jacksonville, Florida, but primarily concentrated off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, are a people known as the Gullah or the Geechee, with a unique language and cultural traditions heavily influenced by the continent of Africa. The Gullah, like many Black Americans, trace their ancestry back to enslaved people forcibly brought to the country from Africa, primarily the western and central coastal regions of the continent. The millions of people brought in chains to North and South America came from countless different ethnic groups, spoke many different languages from one another, practiced different traditions, and followed different faiths. One consequence of slavery in the U.S. was that many enslaved people lost their names, their languages, their faiths, and their cultural traditions. This was the case in most of the southern U.S., where slavery was the most dominant, but was true everywhere the horrible practice occurred. The Sea Islands, however, were something of a different story. The islands were cut off from the mainland by swamps, marshes, rivers, and bays. Coastal cities like Charleston and Savannah were major ports in the transatlantic slave trade, but many of the nearby islands were mostly undeveloped, save for the island plantations, where they were forced to farm crops like cotton, rice, and indigo. The islands, though just off the shore, were pretty cut off from the outside world, and were home mostly to enslaved people from Africa. The relative lack of outside influence meant that the enslaved people in the Sea Islands were able to maintain many of their languages and cultural practices that they'd brought with them from the continent. Coming from a wide variety of ethnic groups, they developed a style of dress, cooking, music, folklore, and artwork, such as the weaving of sweetgrass baskets, that combined a diverse group of elements and influences from all over West and Central Africa. In South Carolina, they called themselves the Gullah, in Georgia, the Geechee, and perhaps most interestingly, they developed their own unique language. The Gullah language is considered a Creole language, combining elements of English with elements of a number of different African languages, such as Mendi and Fulani, which are spoken in parts of West Africa. Many of the words spoken in Gullah come from what is now the West African country of Sierra Leone. Interestingly, Creole, the most spoken language in Sierra Leone, is very similar to Gullah, and many Gullah and Creole speakers can understand each other pretty well. What's most fascinating about this is that the development of Creole happened in nearly the opposite way that the Gullah language was formed. Sierra Leone was a British colony established as a place where formerly enslaved people and their descendants who wanted to return to the continent of their ancestry could go. Many black people from Nova Scotia, Jamaica, and England, as well as Gullah from the Sea Islands, made the journey to Sierra Leone. Known as Sierra Leone Creoles, their descendants make up only a small percentage of the country's population, but they exerted a much greater influence on the country, especially in its language. Creole developed as these mostly English-speaking new arrivals communicated with each other and with the people who were already there, whereas Gullah developed in the opposite way, as speakers of African languages were dropped into an English-speaking country. The Gullah face a number of challenges in preserving their culture. Though around 200,000 Americans are Gullah, the language is only spoken fluently by a few hundred people. The Sea Islands have become popular tourist destinations, and urban areas along the coast are sprawling further across the islands, with development posing a major threat to their way of life and language. One step in preserving Gullah language and culture was the designation of much of the coast of the Sea Islands as the Gullah-Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, though their language in particular is at real risk of being lost. For our next cultural enclave, we have the Amish, who live in rural areas throughout Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, as well as other parts of the Midwest, and in total consist of about 360,000 people. Some of the highest percentages live in sparsely populated counties in Ohio and Indiana, but in sheer numbers, the largest Amish community and their cultural heart is Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, whose percentages are thrown off by the county's fairly large population in the city of Lancaster. South central Pennsylvania is often known as Amish country, and though you'll see strong Amish communities all throughout rural parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other states like Indiana and Wisconsin, south central Pennsylvania is definitely where they're the most dominant. They're often referred to as the Pennsylvania Dutch, which is a bit of a misnomer as their ancestry is primarily German. The term is a mispronunciation of the German word for German, Deutsch, or in the Amish dialect of the language called Pennsylvania German, Deutsch. The origins of the Amish can be traced to a Protestant Christian religious movement called Anabaptism, which developed in Switzerland and spread throughout German-speaking areas like Germany, Austria, Alsace, as well as other areas like Moravia and the Netherlands. Their primary belief that set them apart from other Protestant groups was their practice of baptizing adults. In the coming centuries, the Anabaptists began to branch off into different sects under the teachings of various religious leaders. Followers of a popular priest named Menno Simons, for example, became known as Mennonites. In the late 1600s, a Swiss-German Anabaptist leader named Jakob Amann entered the scene. He was part of an Anabaptist sect known as the Swiss Brethren, who were fairly similar to the Mennonites. A key Anabaptist belief was that sinners should be excommunicated. Swiss Brethren practiced this by simply not allowing band members to participate in communion. Jakob Amann, on the other hand, believed they should be fully shunned and cast out of society. He traveled and spread his religious views, which became particularly popular in a German region known as the Palatinate, where many of his Swiss followers fled. Amann's stricter teachings, though, led to disagreements with the Swiss Brethren, and eventually to a division in the sect. His followers became known as Amish after him, and the rest of the Swiss Brethren began rebranding themselves as Mennonites. Today, the Amish and the Mennonites still have very similar beliefs, but the Mennonites, as they did historically, practice a less strict version of their faith. Important with the Amish faith is a strong sense of community and work ethic, plain dress, and a traditional lifestyle without technology. Because of this, most Amish began establishing farming communities where they could work the soil and live among those who practiced their same beliefs. Because the faith meant an adherence to not just religious beliefs but an entire lifestyle, Amish lived amongst themselves, in communities fairly isolated, at least socially, from places that were geographically close by. The Amish, though, faced religious persecution in Europe. At the same time, the British colony of Pennsylvania was gaining a reputation as a safe haven of religious freedom, and many Amish as well as Mennonites joined the large number of Germans making the journey to Pennsylvania. They mostly put down roots in Lancaster County, in an area along the Susquehanna River that was fairly flat and suitable for agriculture. Since then, there have been a number of changes that have impacted the Amish. Back in Europe, most fled to Pennsylvania, and those who remained left and became Mennonites. Today, there are no Amish communities on the continent where the movement began, and they're a uniquely American religious community. Many moved west, establishing communities in Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, and other parts of the country, and even into Canada. The rise in modern technology like automobiles, the internet, and mobile phones, and many people's dependence on them has made it increasingly difficult for Amish people to maintain their traditional lifestyle. Many left and joined Mennonite communities in the US, which typically allow the use of technology. On the other hand, their population is growing rapidly, doubling every 20 years. They're famous for their hard work ethic and strong sense of community, which is seen in activities like barn raisings, their traditional dress and agricultural lifestyle, and the horse and buggies many use for transportation. However, hardly all Amish people adhere to the traditional lifestyle, and there are significant differences between each community. It's their lifestyle and strong sense of community that have allowed the Amish to remain a cultural enclave. Geography has made that difficult. They sit just outside the northeast megalopolis, the urban core of the United States, with Philadelphia just an hour away. One of the most fascinating aspects of Amish culture is that they've maintained their own language over more than 300 years in the English-dominated U.S. Descended from the German spoken in the Palatinate, where many Amish immigrated from, it's called Pennsylvania German, and has developed in isolation from other dialects of the language, making it pretty distinct. Most Amish, as well as a number of Mennonites, speak it as their first language, and refer to anyone who isn't Amish as the English. Interestingly, Pennsylvania, as well as a bunch of other locations in the state, have different names in Pennsylvania German, which are pretty interesting to check out. What is now the United States was not only colonized by Britain. Huge swaths of the country were once conquered and settled by other empires, primarily Spain and France, and indeed, pockets of formerly French and Spanish lands have, especially in the case of Spanish in the Southwest, major populations that speak their language. Other colonial ventures, like those of the Netherlands and Sweden, were invaded by Britain and absorbed into their territory so long ago that they haven't left much of a linguistic mark on their respective regions. However, there's one notable exception to this rule. Russia maintained a colonial presence in Alaska, an enormous territory, for over 100 years, and sold it to the United States a full 2 centuries after the fall of New Sweden and New Netherland. In fact, Alaska was a Russian colony long after France or Spain had lost control of anything that would eventually become part of the US. But hardly anyone in Alaska speaks Russian. In fact, a larger percentage of Alaskans speak Spanish than the language of the country they were part of just a century and a half ago. Part of the reason for this is that Russia hardly sent any settlers to the colony. There were only ever a few hundred Russians in Alaska, and they were mostly fur traders. The majority of the population were native people who spoke a wide variety of different languages. Russian influence is seen more in religion than language. Many Alaska natives converted to the Russian Orthodox Church, but few changed their language. The major exception is in a small town on the Kenai Peninsula called Ninilchik. Russian fur traders moved to the area, and many married and started families with native people who lived there, many of whom were members of the Alutiiq and Dena'ina peoples. Their descendants were known as Alaska Creoles, people with both Alaska Native and Russian ancestry, and many of them spoke Russian. The Russian language also continued after the U.S. purchase of Alaska on Kodiak Island, Alaska's largest island and the second largest in the country after just the Big Island of Hawaii. Kodiak was a major Russian hunting and fur trading center. In both Ninilchik and Kodiak, the language developed into their own unique dialects of Russian, called Ninilchik Russian and Kodiak Russian. In 1964, however, the second largest earthquake ever recorded in the world, with a shocking magnitude of 9.2 on the Richter scale, struck Alaska. Kodiak Island was one of the most devastated parts of the state. Sections of the island sunk by more than 5 feet due to movement of tectonic plates. A huge tsunami struck, and the towns on the island were pretty much destroyed. The earthquake's devastation caused most of the native speakers of Kodiak Russian to flee to other parts of the state, breaking up the linguistic community, and today, little information exists on Kodiak Russian, but it's only spoken by a few elderly people and hasn't been spoken on Kodiak or the islands around it since the earthquake. The dialect of Ninilchik Russian, though, still exists in the town. It was influenced significantly by the Alutiiq and Dena'ina languages and is the last place where Russian is spoken in Alaska. Ninilchik Russian, though, is likely to become a lost dialect. Less than 10 people speak it, and all of them are at least in their 80s. For the final cultural enclave on this list, we move to the middle of the country, to the state of Oklahoma, which has the largest percentage of indigenous residents of any state besides Alaska, and the second largest in sheer numbers after California. 500,000 Oklahomans in a state of less than 4 million are Native American, over 13% of the state's population. The U.S. population as a whole is only 2.6% Native American. Oklahoma is, especially relative to the rest of the U.S., a major center of the country's indigenous population. Dozens of Native American tribes live in Oklahoma, but the 5 largest are the Cherokee, Choctaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, and Seminole, whose land in eastern Oklahoma takes up nearly half of the state's area. On top of that, the Cherokee Nation are by far the country's most populous Native American nation, with over 700,000 members, more than twice that of the country's second most populous group. This large Native American presence, however, comes as a result of an enormous and brutal forced migration. None of these 5 tribes, which give Oklahoma such a large indigenous population, are originally from there at all. In fact, the ancestral homeland of each sits in the southeastern part of the country, hundreds and in some cases thousands of miles away. The Seminole are originally from Florida, the Choctaw from Mississippi and Louisiana, the Chickasaw from Mississippi and Tennessee, the Muskogee from Alabama, Georgia, and northern Florida, and the Cherokee from Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, and 6 other neighboring states. War, disease, and genocide at the hands of European colonists saw many tribes wiped off the map, with survivors fleeing west. Not wanting to meet the same fate, these 5 tribes hoped that if they adopted lifestyles and practices similar to those of American settlers, they'd be seen in the eyes of the U.S. government as civilized, and they wouldn't meet the same fate as practically all the other native people in the eastern U.S. Among other things, they created a written form of their languages, the Cherokee creating their own alphabet, formed centralized governments with capital cities, adopted similar styles of architecture and dress as well as European systems of land ownership, and many converted to Christianity and learned English. Some even adopted the horrible practice of slavery. In total, thousands of Black Americans were enslaved by members of the 5 tribes, who implemented systems of plantation labor like those throughout other parts of the South. For a while, their attempts to adopt a lifestyle similar to that of the American settlers in order to stay protected were successful. They were often referred to as the quote-unquote 5 civilized tribes, and though their territory continued to shrink, maintained sovereignty over their homelands well into the 19th century. However, by the beginning of the 1800s, things were beginning to change, as more and more settlers moved into the southeast. Plantation agriculture dominated the region, and there was pressure from the region's powerful planter elite to open up more land for slave plantations. On top of that, a gold rush in Georgia in 1828 saw the state's population skyrocket, and 1 year later, Andrew Jackson, a military leader who'd waged war against the Seminoles in Florida, was elected president. Jackson and his successor, Martin Van Buren, signed and put into effect the Indian Removal Act just 1 year later. The law pushed the 5 tribes off their land in the southeast to a new territory set aside hundreds of miles to the west in a forced migration that lasted several decades. Known as the Trail of Tears, thousands of Native Americans, as well as the Black people they'd enslaved, died on this exodus west. Those who survived arrived and settled in an area within and just to the west of the Ozarks and Ouachita Mountains, which became known as the Indian Territory, where they set up autonomous tribal governments. In 1890, as American settlers were moving further west, the U.S. government broke the western half of Indian Territory off and named it Oklahoma Territory. Again, as before, the desire for new land for American settlers came at the cost of the land inhabited by the country's native people. Settlers flocked to the newly opened land, creating a nearly overnight population boom, and in 1907, the 2 territories were merged into the state of Oklahoma. In practice, statehood ended tribal control of this land, but importantly, it never did so officially. A landmark Supreme Court case in 2020 decided that because Oklahoma's statehood never officially dissolved them, all of eastern Oklahoma, the former Indian Territory, are still reservations today, and that the 5 tribes have legal jurisdiction over tribal memberships living in that land, which is a large part of the region's population. The entire city of Tulsa, for example, is divided between the Muskogee, Cherokee, and Osage reservations, and has the second highest percentage of Native people in a major U.S. city. Two other cities in the state, Norman and Oklahoma City, have the third and fourth highest percentages, respectively. There are plenty more examples of places in the United States whose residents, either through culture, religion, language, or some combination of the three, are isolated somewhat from the areas around them. I'm planning on making this into a series, so if there are any cultural enclaves in the US or around the world that you'd like to see me cover, please let me know in the comments. I want to give a big thank you to everyone who's already joined my Patreon. Through it, you can access different things such as behind-the-scenes videos, early access to maps I create, an exclusive Discord Q&A with me, and shoutouts in my videos. Please be sure to check out the TII store, where you'll be able to purchase all sorts of official, That Is Interesting products and merchandise, including shirts, hoodies, embroidered beanies, masks, mugs, embroidered backpacks, laptop stickers and sleeves, and so on. I really appreciate the over 800 of you who have already joined my Discord server. If you haven't joined the Discord server yet, it's a great place to continue conversations about the topics discussed in these videos, interact with fellow viewers, and help provide information and suggestions for future videos. It's a great community, and we do fun stuff like geography game nights, live podcasts, and so on. I'll put links to both the Patreon and the Discord in the description. Thank you for watching this video, and I hope you learned something new. Subscribe for more content like this. I cover the countries, cities, people, and places of the world and beyond. These videos will leave you saying, that is interesting.